both your audience for teacher diversity as well as awareness month. Now, there are 2 clipboards are being circulated, and please sign, and faculty members, I still do have some more the attendance verification sheet, so you can help yourself right there. And the students, you must write your ID number, and you don't need that attendance sheet. All right. Sign-in sheet, that's what I talked about, and then I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, who is a professor at Department of Journalism as well as English. So, this is Michael Moreau. Michael Moreau has taught at the college for 18 years and have gotten to know many people across campus through advising Educator and participating in a wide variety of campus activities. During the time, he has served on the Academic Senate and on the Guild Executive Committee. He has had a split role of teaching journalism and English. So he has a special interest in reading and writing. He has a master's degree in English from Cal State LA and in journalism from USC. He has worked as a writer and editor for newspapers, edited the book John Fonte, right?
That's it.
Fonte, yeah. And H.L. Mencken, a personal correspondence, and currently writes book reviews for New World Review. He is also a founding member, or he was rather, founding member of the Library and Information Competence Governance Committee. I would like to welcome Michael Moreau.
Thank you very much. And this is Jane Puyava, who is a longtime friend and former student here, now getting her bachelor's degree in journalism at Cal Poly, I think next month, very soon. And she's going to help me out a bit with this presentation. What I've handed you, this green sheet here, is a little quiz of your general knowledge derived from E.D. Hirsch's book, Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. I figured a lecture by a professor needs to have a little quiz attached to it. Good luck. This is a greatly condensed version of the entire list in the book, Cultural Literacy. So the subject of this talk is reading. I assign what I consider a modest amount of reading to students, but many of them, I think, consider it to be excessive. I'm not sure that this was always the case. A few years ago, I was thinking back when I was putting this little talk together, I assigned a farewell to arms to my English 101 students. And there is, by the way, a quote from that book out at the front of the administration building with a misspelling that has always bothered me. In one particular class, there was a young woman who surprised me with her engagement with the text. Her participation in the class was infectious and prompted other students to speak out as well. She understood that Frederick and Catherine's affair in the book was doomed. Wounded soldiers don't typically marry their nurses and live happily ever after. And she also recognized, as many didn't, that the book was profoundly anti-war and made a mockery of the kind of jingoism we've been treated with in the current presidential debates, where candidates, while not comparing their sex organ sizes, compete to assert who is most patriotic and most eager to send young men and women to war. What I discovered halfway into this class was that this particular young woman had not only closely read the novel, which is always refreshing, but that she had outlined every chapter so thoroughly that her notes were almost as long as the book itself. She could have taught the class. I would like to say that the student went on to earn her doctorate in English, or maybe to write a novel of her own. But actually, I ran into her in a restaurant a few months back, and she's now practicing real estate law. That kind of immersion in a text is something I don't really see very often anymore. A couple of weeks ago, in a coffee shop that I go to, an old man, even older than me, asked me what I did, and I said I taught English and journalism. And he went into a lengthy riff about the importance of English, and especially reading, and how not enough people in this country realize that. He said reading is the foundation of everything, even math. He went on for several minutes, and I interjected that his Jeremiad was really preaching to the choir. No one likes to be preached at, I don't think. And I don't really want to do that here. But I see a problem. I see a problem that's kind of a crisis in education and in the state of reading. And it isn't all young people. From 1978 through 2014, Gallup and Pew Research tracked adult reading habits, and found a steady increase in the percentage of Americans who said they hadn't read a single book in the previous year. From 8% over here on the left, from 8% in 1978, that was 8% who said they hadn't read a book in the previous year. It shot up to 23% in 2012 and 2014. So it went from 8% to 23%. And since this was a self-reporting survey, one can only assume that the percentage is actually probably much higher. That's a quarter of adults who hadn't read a book in a year. In 2013, the Los Angeles Times reported, it was Hector Tobar, a Los Angeles Times writer who spoke to us from right here about 2 years ago. It was reported that surveys conducted by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development indicated that reading skills of American adults were significantly lower than those of adults in other developed countries. What this shows here is just concurrently with the reading skills kind of dropping, our SAT scores over the period from 1968 in verbal and writing gradually falling downward, SAT scores in reading and writing. A report in The Guardian analyzed presidential State of the Union addresses from 1790 to 2013. That's from the first State of the Union address to President Obama's State of the Union address excuse me. Okay, lost this. See if you can hear me anyway. President Obama's State of the Union address in 2013. And using the Flesch-Kincaid readability test, the results showed, to put it bluntly, a steady dumbing down of the presidential speech. This may be a future State of the Union address, if we look at that downward trend.
We're going to talk about a lot of different subjects, and you know, it's nice Friday night, what the heck, right? You know the thing I'll be great at? That people are thinking, but the thing and I do very well at it, military. I am the toughest guy. I'm really rich, I'll show you that in a second. And we're going to start winning so much that you're going to be sick and tired of winning. You're going to get bored with winning. But you know what? We're going to keep winning anyway, right? 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 He knows. We are going to make our country great again. We are going to. We are going to. I love the Mexican people. Many Mexican people work for me. Many Mexican people I do business with here. Mexico does not like us. Mexico is not our friend. Mexico is the new China. Nobody builds walls better than me, believe me. We need a border. We need a wall. But I don't mean one of those walls where you go to Home Depot and buy a ladder and you walk across. I mean a wall much higher. That's peanuts. That's peanuts. No, no, no. Much higher. Much higher. I do know what I'm doing. I want to help women with women's health issues. Nobody's going to be able to do it like me. And like, a lot of us are really smart. I'm really smart. You know, I'm really good with that stuff. You know, anybody that likes me, I like. I just want to make this country so great. And that's what's going to happen. And that's what's going to happen. Oh, it's so beautiful. The American dream is dead. But China, oh, I love that sign. Look at that, huh? Wow. Wow. No, that's true.
So, a little bit of comic relief there, but I would suggest, my suggestion is that if you don't read challenging text, challenging writing, your vocabulary is going to be limited to words like amazing, awesome, incredible, great, abstractions. As a teacher who believes that their writing and reading are intimately linked, I think a lot about the state of public discourse. I also worry about what is happening to my own reading habits. Let me tell you about a personal experience. About 5 years ago, I decided during the winter break to read War and Peace, a book that's been sitting on my shelf, looking at me longingly for a long time. So in January and February of that year, I completed all 1,224 pages. And by the time I got to the end, I had a grasp of most of the characters' names, including the many patronymics and nicknames. And my wife suggested to me that I reread it right away while it was fresh in my mind. But I didn't do that. I'm well aware, and I tell students about this, of Nabokov's dictum that the only good reader is a rereader. And I had read Anna Karenina 5 or 6 times, finding it richer with every reading. I used to assign it to Honors 102 classes. But I didn't get back to War and Peace. And when I recently read Nicholas Carr's fascinating 2011 book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, I was reminded again of War and Peace, which he specifically cites as a book that he didn't think that he could tackle now, although he once slogged through long and often highly technical books. Like Carr, I'm not sure I could get through such a work, given the reshaping of my brain, which he says is attributable to the pervasive internet use, where we frantically flit from Google to email to text to Wikipedia to Twitter to Facebook to Instagram to Google to email to Facebook, where I used to find myself where I used to find it easy to immerse myself in a book or a lengthy article, Carr says, and I can relate directly to this, that's rarely the case anymore. Now my concentration starts to drift after a page or two. I get fidgety, lose the thread, begin looking for something else to do. I'm suffering from the same symptoms. I rarely finish a New Yorker or a New York Review of Books article in one sitting. And more I find myself pausing mid-chapter in a book to check my email or go get a cup of coffee. Given the predicament that Carr and I face, I wondered about our students and the many people who don't have a history with books, for whom reading, as a student wrote in my English 101 class this winter, isn't really my favorite thing to do. If reading isn't the favorite thing of many students, where do they get the general knowledge they need to succeed, not only in the working world, but as responsible citizens? The answer I often hear, and sometimes I hear from colleagues here, is they get it from other platforms. That's an ugly word, platforms. But do they? In that freshman English class and others, and in my journalism classes, I also find more women in the desks and more women succeeding in the quizzes and in writing assignments based on reading. I wondered if besides a decline in reading, or at least long-form reading, there was a growing gender gap affecting readers. To research this issue, I went to our library catalog and databases. I looked at the U.S. Census figures, reports from the National Endowment for the Arts, an organization called Common Sense Media, a report from Public Agenda, the National Literacy Trust, Pew Research Center. Also, there were helpful books, the Carr book I mentioned, Peg Tyer's book called The Trouble with Boys, Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism, Ian Leslie's Curious, and Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in the Digital Age by Sherry Turkle, a new book that I highly recommend. Many now, even in the academic world, say you don't have to read War and Peace. And of course that's true. There are many comprehensive histories of the debacle of Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1810 to 1812. But what we really read it for is what it can offer us about human nature and the incredible sadness of life. Because it's also really a love story and a story of families and friendship and betrayal. No, we don't need to read War and Peace. We don't need to read Anna Karenina. We don't need to read many things. We don't need to listen to Moonlight Sonata. We don't need to visit LACMA. We don't need to learn to play a musical instrument. But aren't we better for doing these things? Now we seem to be questioning those values. They are said to be elitist, clinging onto relics of a dying culture. How did learning become an elitist enterprise? Several decades ago, Christopher Lasch, in Culture of Narcissism, suggested that learning has always been an elitist exercise. But in his argument, Lasch says that education is now attacked from all sides. From the left, that it preserves traditional Western-centric values, and from the right, that it enshrines what is broadly considered secular humanism. Radicals attack the school system on the grounds that it perpetuates an obsolescent literary culture, the linear culture. Remember here now, Lasch was writing this almost 50 years ago, but he said, culture of the written word, culture of the written word, imposing it on the masses. But it might be suggested that by now the system has largely abandoned this. To be sure, critical thinking is still given lip service, but no longer is it an article of faith that critical thinking derives largely from deep and broad reading. People increasingly find themselves unable to use language with ease and precision, to recall the basic facts of their country, to make logical deductions, to understand any but the most rudimentary written text, or even to grasp their constitutional rights, Lasch said in 1979. Think of Republican leader Donald Trump's famous declaration that he loves the poorly educated. As if that's a virtue, right? His followers' knowledge of the Constitution doesn't seem to go much further than a fervent faith in the Second Amendment. But worried that he now also seems in recent contests to have gained votes among even the college educated in Massachusetts, for example. Even before the internet, there was a growing deficit in what students were learning in public schools and bringing with them to colleges and universities. Every year, this stood out for me in Lasch's book, Startling. He wrote this in mid-1970s. Every year, he says 40 to 60% of students at the University of California find themselves required to enroll in remedial English. Just a few weeks ago, and I was telling Jane, I had to read the editorial a few times, and I thought, maybe I'll use this in this talk. And I had to keep reading it. On February 26th, in the Los Angeles Times, it said that starting this year, students in the Los Angeles Unified School District, in order to graduate, will have to earn a grade of D, that's D, or better, in 4 years of English and 3 years of math. In order to graduate, they'll have to have 4 years of D's in English and 3 years of math. Why are we asking so little of them? And of ourselves, I would say. This has consequences. This has real consequences. Increasing numbers of citizens don't know their state has 2 senators, or that the Fifth Amendment might come in handy if they're ever charged with a crime, or that the president you vote for, or maybe who you don't vote for, will appoint justices to the Supreme Court, and that those justices are capable of changing the way lives are lived for a generation. Yes, of course, factoids like those can be found on Google. But does Google increase critical thinking skills? Ian Leslie, in a more recent book, have to keep going back to books. Curious, it's called, Curious. Came out just this last year. Argues that thinking skills require a foundation of deep and broad knowledge. William Shakespeare went to a school where people were made to learn more than 100 Latin figures of rhetoric. They also had to become familiar with the original text by Seneca and Cicero. After those young years of grilling and roasting and the fires of ancient Rome and Greece, we're not sure if Shakespeare had fun in school or if he was told he was awesome for showing up. But he went on to produce the greatest body of creative work ever attributed to one person. Leslie, in that book, Curious, also explains how the best chess players become grandmasters. Research indicates that they have generally memorized so many combinations on the board that when challenging moves come up, they can quickly run through the inventory of what they have seen before to apply it to what lies in front of them. He concludes that rather than being an abstract thinking skill, chess is highly knowledge-bound. He says the top players have tens of thousands of chess positions stored in their memories. The point he's trying to make, he says that learning skills grow out of specific knowledge. And specific knowledge includes and incorporates cultural knowledge, the plot of Hamlet, the composition of the Supreme Court, a general understanding of how the Oscars are awarded, how humans cause climate change. In terms of cultural literacy, coined by E.D. Hirsch 3 decades ago, we really aren't doing so well. One of the things that Americans should be familiar with on Hirsch's list is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Although it is usually at the top of list of best American novels, it's unclear how many Americans now read this book. But how many people, you know the story, how many people could follow the story of the various king and duke in Twain's tale and not see Donald Trump as a phony and mendacious huckster? Would they get wise and tar and feather him and send him out of town on a rail, like happens to the king in the book? Hirsch doesn't suggest that students need only memorize lists or bits of unrelated facts, but rather that they combine a storehouse of facts with higher level reasoning. Curriculum should be taught not just as a series of terms, he says, but as a vivid system of shared association. But without background knowledge, those 10,000 chess moves, higher level reasoning is not possible. This winter, I taught an English 101 class that started with 23 students. Some say the most motivated students enroll in the short sessions. On the first day, I asked students to write a brief description of a book they had read during the previous year and what about it had particularly impressed them, either positively or negatively. The results weren't encouraging. But in both the quality of the writing and the thoughts expressed, I could tell that several of the students would be widowed out over the next 5 weeks. Here's a couple of samples. I find book reading tedious and boring. When I find a book that interests me, it has to be romantic. reading is not really one of my favorite things to do. Okay. When they did actually name a book, which was refreshing, it's not clear that they really understood very much about the content. I thought it was touching that a student said she found To Kill a Mockingbird her, this is what she said, all-time favorite story. But I was sorry to hear that she also called it a work of fiction set in nonfiction, a work of nonfiction set in the 1990s. That one student said the last book he could remember clearly was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Made me feel that somehow the public school system had been a terrible failure for him. But several of the students had comments along the line of, I find reading a book tedious and boring. I was led to believe that some of them hadn't even figured out how to tell teachers what they'd like to hear. What I also found out was that the female students who outnumbered the males enrolled 2 to 1 were most likely to have remembered at least one book they had read over the past year. 12 of the 23 students slogged it through the 5-week session. 10 passed. 7 men and 3 women. So, 7 women, I'm sorry, 10 students passed this class out of the 23 who started. 7 of them were women and 3 were men. 7 women passed the class, 3 men passed the class. 2 others stayed in the class till the end but didn't pass. This is only anecdotal evidence. This isn't, this isn't scientific. But it's not like what I see from semester to semester. Reading and writing. These are wedded skills, inseparable skills. In the spring of the 2013 edition of Reference and User Services Quarterly, a librarian journal, Kate Summers reported that library science as a discipline has begun to examine gender differences and implications for library patrons and services. What librarians are concerned with are how gender, the report says, affects choices in reading materials, internet usage, library usage, perceptions about what is considered appropriate reading for each gender, and reading abilities. There is research afoot on whether gender has a significant effect on reading interests and habits, and whether those habits and interests might be biological or cultural, or a combination of the two. Apparently, reading ability is often a major factor, the report argues, when examining gender differences in children and adolescents. What has been found is that girls consistently outperform boys on tests of reading comprehension, although the reading isn't although the reason isn't clear. In Educational Review in 2010, Sarah Logan and Rona Johnson reported that a long-term study of adolescents in 43 countries had indicated gender differences in reading favoring girls in practically every participating country. Isolating 15-year-olds, it found that in all 43 countries, including the U.S., girls outperform boys in tests of reading comprehension. And these were consistent regardless of the types of instruction given in these 43 different countries. The Center for Education Policy reported male students in every state where data was available. Here's some of the data. Lag behind females in reading. Now, without venturing into the world of neuroscience, which I don't know much about, Research indicates that there are gender differences in brain activation during reading and reading-related tasks. Some reports suggest that young men are more open to phonological approaches to reading than girls, that the reading instruction, they say, isn't typically broken down phonetically. This is all research is in germinal stage. It could be the case that boys benefit from reading instruction with strong phonics, Logan and Johnson say, but this is not true. What we do know, and what is troubling, is that far more young women enroll in and graduate from college than young men. Nationally, about 57% of college students are women. Here at Glendale, the percentage is about 54%. It's unclear why this is the case, but the ratio in humanities courses is even more dramatic than in college overall, where STEM courses are emphasized above all. In the book, Trouble with Boys, Peg Tyre is a writer, a journalist primarily, but she researched this because she was concerned about her own young boys, and how they were doing in school. So she did some research for a book she called Trouble with Boys. And she says, a candidate for college without a strong course load in high school probably won't be able to handle college level work. And she says, currently more girls and boys are on the college prep track in high school. And on the whole, they get better grades than boys and graduate from high school with higher GPAs. This is one of the trends showing this. She says that many of the most selective colleges, this I thought was interesting. She says that many of the most selective colleges in the country have so many, and she's talking about Ivy League colleges and, elite colleges, have so many more female than male applicants that some have even quietly begun to experiment with affirmative action type programs to bring more boys to campus. On a campus like this, of course, students are self-selected. The question is how to deal with students with apparently diminishing reading skills or even reading interests. How do we make them want to read or find the time to read? How do we deal with all of the distractions? The Pew Research Center reported at the end of last year that 92% of teens report going online daily. Probably not too surprising. 92% of teens report going online daily. But get this, including 24% who say they are online almost constantly. This doesn't really bode very well for book reading, I don't think. In Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985, Neil Postman said, when a population becomes distracted by trivia, when cultural life is defined by perpetual round of entertainments, when serious public conversation becomes a form of baby talk, again, I go back to the presidential debates for that, when, in short, a people become an audience in their public business, a vaudeville act, then a nation finds itself at risk. Culture death is a clear possibility. Literature, and I'm biased toward what we call literature here, but literature, Philip Roth said, takes a habit of mind that has disappeared. It requires silence, some form of isolation, and sustained concentration in the presence of an enigmatic thing. Enigmatic, it requires concentration, silence, quieting down the distraction. There are signs of hope, perhaps, because many of the students in that same Pew survey said that they find their smartphones and social media a distraction. Many are signing off their Facebook pages. One of my students said that she considered her iPhone a distraction. She told me that she actually didn't tell me. She wrote this in a essay that the iPhone is a distraction. But she still felt compelled to check her iPhone during class. We know that iPads and laptops are distractions not only to the students using them, but even to the students around them who aren't using them. But maybe there's a backlash to the perpetual sensory bombardment. For those of us who find our attention span, like me, slipping away, cognitive neuroscientist Marianne Wolf says, adults who grew up reading serious literature can force themselves to focus on long text and reactivate the neural circuits for deep reading that they may have lost after spending time online rather than on books. You can reactivate those neural circuits. For children without the book reading history, the problem is more complicated. They need to develop those circuits in the first place. The crucial thing, Wolf says, is that we need to read to children and with them. We need to read to children and with them. Another recent New York Times editorial was very encouraging. I'm sorry, the first one I'm talking about was a Los Angeles Times editorial. This is a New York Times editorial. So there's a resurgence in brick and mortar bookstores. There's one in Pasadena. In fact, there's a man who's opened up 1 and 2, and now he's got 3 bookstores in New York City recently opened. Even Amazon, often blamed for shutting down most of the country's independent booksellers, has opened up shop in Seattle and plans to expand to other cities. I think that's encouraging. Other reports say that younger people, although David Denby was quoted, the New Yorker was quoted as saying that he overheard a younger person say that books smell like old people. There's also indications that young people are going back to bookstores. Maybe some of you are. In her book, The Common Reader, Virginia Woolf said, "Are there not some pursuits that we practice because they are good in themselves, and some pleasures that are final? And is not this among them? I have sometimes dreamt, at least, that when the day of judgment comes, and the great conquerors and lawyers and statesmen come to receive their rewards, their crowns, their laurels, their names carved indelibly upon imperishable marble, the Almighty will turn to Peter and will say, not without a certain envy when he sees us coming with our books under our arms, 'Look, these need no reward. We have nothing to give them here. They have loved reading.'" That's in my thought. If you took I did want to say, if you took that little quiz I passed around, it might not have been enough for everybody. I'll tell you how many you answers you should have known for a passing grade. And the answer to that is all of them. And you can blame Hirsch for that, not me. Thanks very much.
And in the meantime, I really appreciate if you guys can fill out this Women's History Month survey questionnaire. I really appreciate it. Is there anybody who doesn't have this? It will take about maybe, a few seconds. Okay, go ahead and raise your hand and, yeah, here goes. Questions?
You want to say them? Oh, you want that? Okay. You want the mic, or you just wanted to speak loudly? Maybe you should take the mic.
Anybody questions?
One thing that I got out of your lecture is that a lot of people cannot read because they cannot concentrate because of the change in the culture, etc. And I have noticed that a lot of the schools, students try to beat this lack of concentration problem by taking illegal drugs or like Adderall or something like that to be able to concentrate and then do well on exams. I am wondering that maybe people don't read and because they can't concentrate, and that is sort of like ADD. Maybe a lot more students should be tested for ADD and given accommodations. What would you say about this?
Yeah, where do I get the drugs? I think you may have a good point, but I think that I was sort of concentrating on how the internet, social media kind of gets in the way of concentration. And actually, they say it kind of reshapes your brain, that's good, I think, talking about a similar issue there, yeah.
I got in there, Michael, I got 24 out of 25.
Not good enough.
Who's Toni Morrison?
The Nobel Prize American novelist. Nobel Prize winning American novelist. African American novelist. Anybody, comments, questions?
Any other questions?
Encouraging children to start reading would be a good basis, a good foundation. And maybe our lifestyles have changed and parents are not allocating enough time to spend with their children and put this love in their children's mind.
Right.
That would be a beginning. And of course, it continues in every age group.
Sure.
There should be some actions to be taken. And we are, as teachers, we continue to encourage them to read, and we should still continue.
Okay, great. Yeah,
My comment or question really would be, I remember, you mentioned Huck Finn. It's a book that I've many times loved, but the first time I read it, I resisted finishing it because it was assigned to me in school. I was a teenager and a boy, and I had other things on my mind, of all sorts. Skateboards, among other things, just other stuff. And what I find myself struggling with is the challenge to get someone excited about. You want someone to be intrinsically interested in something that they must do. There's a contradiction there. To tell people you must be intrinsically interested in something I'm going to force you to do. So the question is, how do we get them to be excited about reading? In other words,
well, yeah, but
how do you address this?
you're talking about after the barn, the horse has already left the barn or whatever they say. I mean, you've got young kids. I think the point of the more than one writer's need here is that you start reading to them when they're very young, and in that way you get them to appreciate the value of reading.
Right.
You don't beat them on the head when they're 15.
Well, but that doesn't help. What I'm getting at is I'm a teacher here, and I get it when they're 19.
Well, for one
I
thing,
don't want to write them off.
For one thing, I think one thing you have to write off is electronic devices in the classroom. You've got to write that off. You've got to write that off. Any kind of electronic devices. Even if they say, oh, I'm just taking notes on my laptop, forget about it. You know?
I think students would be more, they would be more interested in reading if they were given a choice of a list of books to read for their assignment instead of saying, you have to read this. Because I see to my son, he was 8th grade last year,
Right.
top 2 student, he got an academic achievement award for English, and his English teacher was amazing. He inspired him, and he did really well. This year he's getting an F in English because the teacher says, this is it. This is the only book you're gonna read. He's not given a choice.
Okay, so you're saying that there aren't books that should be required reading?
It should be a list that they can choose from.
But then you can't talk about it.
Right.
Wow.
That's an opinion.
It just, dictatorship, like the kind of teacher he has now,
Uh-huh.
totally discourages him from reading and wanting to do well.
Do you think there's a core set of works that should be read sometime during a person's education?
Eventually, but see, when young people are given a choice, they choose something they're interested in. And if they're told that you don't have a choice, this is it, they're resistant to it, and they don't want to.
So they should be able to choose Harry Potter over the
No,
very
no,
thing.
no. So, I mean, it's, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I'm sure there is a list of books that would be acceptable.
Mm.
And they should be given, and say, okay, these are the types of books we have, and, and go and choose the one. And when given a choice, they actually feel empowered to choose a book they like, and they actually like to read.
I'd be thrilled if the student I was talking to this morning, who I just failed on writing this on, if they had ever read Harry Potter, I'd be thrilled.
Yeah.
Because he's never, well, I asked the same question you did, it's an interesting question. I said, what's the last book you read and enjoyed? And his answer was, I don't really like to read. If he'd said Harry Potter, I think he probably would be doing a lot better on this writing assignment. So I can see your point, there's an essential knowledge we need. We also have to somehow, in the face of all these other entertainments,
Right.
get them interested in this candy that is reading,
Because we go to the library, he chooses a book he likes to read, and it depends on the interest he gets. He likes reading, but he just doesn't like the reading assignment that's being given in the class.
Yeah, Vicky?
I don't use the mic, I got a loud voice. I'd just like to share comments that I make to my students, which is that the reading to an infant is in fact helping that child to build the core storage units in the brain that will help that child to learn. So reading to them, even when you might say, oh, they have no idea what I'm reading, they are in fact taking that information and using it. And when my students hear that, they take that and think about it in terms of their responsibilities when they have children to do that. Now, they may not have had someone reading to them, and they may be then sitting saying to themselves, oh wow, somebody had read to me when I was an infant, I might be doing better in this class. But it seems to be encouraging, and I'm always pleased that when I ask students to read things, they don't growl at me, and maybe because I teach history and they're fun things to read, but they come back and thank me. Oh, that was a really good book. Thank you for asking that. So I think the issue of choice is important to a certain extent, but in the end, we do have to say we have a purpose in asking you to read something, and so there might be this choice, that choice, or a third one, but that doesn't allow for the conversation. Not everybody's read the same thing, and that's another empowering part of it. I think the issue of choice, shoot me on this one, but somehow I think that we are saying that people can have any choice they want when they don't know enough to make good choices.
That's right.
And I say that as my age, I still don't know enough always to make good choices. So I think it's helpful to have other people that I can trust who will say, I'm gonna help you with your choices. And I think we need to do that, because while reading Harry Potter is a lot of fun, and I enjoy it tremendously with my grandchildren, I take greater thrill in watching my granddaughter, who's 13, show me the 11 books she's taking to Europe with her in case she gets bored. So I think that children can learn to love to read, but it's our job.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. You mentioned that when should we question like what material isn't necessarily required anymore, and what can we bring in?
Right.
I recently did some research about changing like the pedagogy, and what about mentoring and bringing in people from outside the classroom and showing how reading can be fun, reading can be exciting, and someone mentioned the intrinsic reward, and how Harry Potter can be of value and can be something that cannot just be educational, but can influence children, and then how can that also create a chain reaction? And because I noticed that it's not just the teachers anymore, that it should be the students, the parents involved, and then I noticed that when mentoring comes into play with students, that's their success also increases.
That's great. I think it's a good idea. Harry Potter keeps coming up, and there have been so many semesters where I've had students, the only book the students could remember reading was Harry Potter, and I think that's, when you're in college, that's tragic. If that's the only book you can remember reading, or the only book you liked to read.
Oh, I don't need the microphone either. Nobody has mentioned alpha brainwaves. When I curl up with a novel, I'm going to a place that's close to meditative.
Right.
Even if you're reading the characters are struggling and it's sad, Toni Morrison or what have you. And the other point we haven't mentioned yet is that there's truth in fiction that you may not find anywhere else. I can't know what it's like to be a soldier on the battlefield unless I read something about that experience, and then I know. And it's just not the same to see something on TV interrupted by commercials all the time. It's not the same to see a movie that's
I agree.
a movie that's been edited through the eyes of the producer in order to sell more and isn't really real. And to know the characters in a novel is a privilege, and there are truths. There's more truth in fiction.
Well, I tried to touch on that.
This is an idea that isn't generally accepted, but those of us who love literature know that it's absolutely true.
Right. Yeah.
Mike,
Yeah.
I have a couple of points to make.
Yeah.
Doing this cultural diversity program for many years, I've noticed the change in our demography. The population is changing. And I've noticed that when we have an English class like this, or any other English or journalism or even history or whatnot, I think we should also include some of the cultural literature of, that reflect the students' background, so to speak. Instead, so to speak, like the European literature, European writing, and so on and so forth. So I hear that some of the students are saying, I'm a Mexican, or I'm the Filipino one that, and I always read, the white man's story or white woman's story, so to speak. So I think that we have to kind of retool ourselves because the demography is changing, particularly in the community college level. So we have to kind of introduce, the literature from other cultures as well. So that would kind of inspire some of the students in public education, whether it's a high school, whether it's a community colleges, whatnot, or other, state university and UC and private universities. I think it's a time for us to really rethink what literature that we should really offer. And here goes, one of my colleagues to talk about that maybe interest is something need to be reflected, although, we may not have enough knowledge to choose the best books, so to speak. But the book doesn't have to be best, any book except maybe porn, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, they can really come up with something best for them. And I think that kind of a critical thinking element by using other people's cultural, literature, I think that is very important for us to reconsider, the classrooms.
That's true.
One of the things that I wanted to suggest also was the fact that I've been in the field of education for a long decades, and I remember even when I was a student that we had to learn who our president was, and we had to learn all the amendments and on and on. Just to part of history, you had to learn all of that. And as a curriculum specialist, which I was in a major school district for a while, I saw the emergence of that being tossed out. Those things weren't important anymore. And one other thing I wanted to suggest was arbitrarily these decisions are being made as to what children should learn. For example, my daughter was in 4th grade, and I noticed half the class could handwrite and half the class couldn't. And I asked the teacher, why is that? And she said, because what do you need to learn how to handwrite your name for? You have computers to do that now. You don't need to learn.
Right.
And so I thought, oh my God, we're really going towards that. So part of your presentation was excellent, where it was almost indicating that we're being very selective, and so through that selection, we're limiting their interests. We're saying, this is what you're going to learn, not this anymore. It's not important. That's what we're getting.
Yeah.
And then when they get to college, there's a lot they don't know.
Sure. Mike?
Yeah, first, thank you for your ringing defense of the written word. That said, I think that Anna Karenina or War and Peace, for most of our students and most of your colleagues, a 1,200-page novel doesn't quite fit in with the hecticness of the lives that people are living now. So I don't want our culture to degenerate into flame wars and Donald Trump any more than you do. But is there a third way that is somewhere between, the real direct that you see and the tremendous time commitment that is involved in, some of the classic novels that you referenced? Did you see anything in your research that was somewhere in the middle where you'd say, yeah, I could live with that?
Well, I think one answer is spend less time online, more time reading. I know that that's not a popular idea, because most people say spend more time online. There has to be a balance. I mean, it's either or. I think. If 25% of upwards of nearly 25% of students say they're online all the time, I think that's problematic.
They are also paying off working in long-hour exploitative jobs, raising children, and looking forward toward a life of academic debt. So.
Yeah.
Well,
Anybody else?
we were talking about earlier, like how the Harry Potter is the general consensus for most readers. There is some everyone, when I was in high school, everyone was talking about Twilight and Harry Potter, and I was talking about a book called The Color Purple.
Okay. Good for you. I applaud you. Good for you.
Let's give a Michael Moreau.
Thank you very much. Great way to end. Thank you very much. This is a greatly condensed version of the entire list in the book, Cultural Literacy. So the subject of this talk is reading. I assign what I consider a modest amount of reading to students, but many of them, I think, consider it to be excessive. I'm not sure that this was always the case. A few years ago, I was thinking back when I was putting this little talk together, I assigned a farewell to arms to my English 101 students. And there is, by the way, a quote from that book out at the front of the administration building with a misspelling that has always bothered me. In one particular class, there was a young woman who surprised me with her engagement with the text. Her participation in the class was infectious and prompted other students to speak out as well. She understood that Frederick and Catherine's affair in the book was doomed. Wounded soldiers don't typically marry their nurses and live happily ever after. And she also recognized, as many didn't, that the book was profoundly anti-war and made a mockery of the kind of jingoism we've been treated with in the current presidential debates, where candidates, while not comparing their sex organ sizes, compete to assert who is most patriotic and most eager to send young men and women to war. What I discovered about halfway into this class was that this particular young woman had not only closely read the novel, which is always refreshing, but that she had outlined every chapter so thoroughly that her notes were almost as long as the book itself. She could have taught the class. I would like to say that the student went on to earn her doctorate in English, or maybe to write a novel of her own. But actually, I ran into her in a restaurant a few months back, and she's now practicing real estate law. That kind of immersion in a text is something I don't really see very often anymore. A couple of weeks ago, in a coffee shop that I go to, an old man, even older than me, asked me what I did, and I said I taught English and journalism. And he went into a lengthy riff about the importance of English, and especially reading, and how not enough people in this country realize that. He said reading is the foundation of everything, even math. He went on for
So I welcome you, both your audience for teacher diversity as well as the Women's History Month. Now, there are 2 clipboards are being circulated, and please sign, and the faculty members, I still do have some more the attendance verification sheet, so you can help yourself right there. And the students, you must write your ID number, and you don't need that attendance sheet. All right. Sign-in sheet, that's what I talk about, and then I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, who is a professor at Department of Journalism as well as English. So, Michael Moreau. Michael Moreau has taught at the college for 18 years and have gotten to know many people across campus through advising Educator and participating in a wide variety of campus activities. During the time, he has served on the Academic Senate and on the Guild Executive Committee. He has had a split role of teaching journalism and English. So he has a special interest in reading and
several minutes, and I interjected that his Jeremiad was really preaching to the choir. No one likes to be preached at, I don't think. And I don't really want to do that here. But I see a problem. I see a problem that's kind of a crisis in education and in the state of reading. And it isn't all young people. From 1978 through 2014, Gallup and Pew Research tracked adult reading habits, and found a steady increase in the percentage of Americans who said they hadn't read a single book in the previous year. From 8%, over here on the left, from 8% in 1978, that was 8% who said they hadn't read a book in the previous year. It shot up to 23% in 2012 and 2014. So it went from 8% to 23%. And since this was a self-reporting survey, one can only assume that the percentage is actually probably much higher. That's a quarter.
Writing. He has a master's degree in English from Cal State LA and in journalism from USC. He has worked as a writer and editor for newspapers, editing the book John Fonte, right?
That's it.
Fonte, yeah. And H.L. Mencken, a personal correspondence, and currently writes book reviews for New World Review. He is also a founding member, or he was rather, founding member of the Library and Information Competence Governance Committee. I would like to welcome Michael Moreau.
Thank you very much. And this is Jane Puyaba, who is a longtime friend and former student here, now getting her bachelor's degree in journalism at Cal Poly Pomona, I think next month, very soon. And she's going to help me out a bit with this presentation. What I've handed you, this green sheet here, is a little quiz of your general knowledge, derived from E.D. Hirsch's book, Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. I figured a lecture by a professor needs to have a little quiz attached to it. Good luck.